heard of Jim Crow, but have you heard of Jane Crow? It's a term coined by a person whose work changed our world, but whose name is not widely known. The Reverend Doctor Pauli Murray, one of the architects of both the civil rights movement and the women's movement, whose ideas were so far ahead of their time that their law school classmates laughed at them when they suggested that the idea of separate but equal was bullshit. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian who talks about queer history on the internet. A note about pronouns. Pauli Murray wrestled with gender, their own and the broader concept of it, at a time when conversations around gender were largely binary. Pauli identified alternately as a boy-girl, a man in a woman's body, and later in life as a woman. It's tough to say how Pauli would understand their gender today, so there's no consensus on which pronouns to use for them. I've chosen to use they, them in this video while still referring to Pauli as a woman because they interacted with the world as a woman. But there's no one correct way to understand Pauli Murray's gender. Anna Pauline Murray was born shortly after noon on November 20th, 1910, to a nurse named Agnes and a teacher and a poet named William. They were the descendant of free and enslaved Black Americans, of Native Americans, and of Irish Americans. Pauli was effectively orphaned at age 3 when their mother died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage, and the 6 Murray children were split up because their father couldn't care for all of them. Pauli went to live with their Aunt Pauline, after whom they were named, in Durham, North Carolina. Aunt Pauline was a teacher and was an unshakable force of love and acceptance in Pauli's life. She let Pauli wear pants and boys' hats, except to church on Sunday, and encouraged their curiosity and ambition. Pauli was therefore a precocious and motivated student who could read by the time they were 4 and who graduated high school at 15 as the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, starting forward on the basketball team, and class secretary, among other accolades. Pauli went on to graduate from New York City's Hunter College with a BA in English in 1933, right at the height of the Great Depression. They scraped by for a couple of years, working nights at the YWCA where they lived and selling subscriptions to an academic journal. He even rode the rails as a hobo for a while, posing as a teenage boy called Pete, or the Dude. But eventually malnutrition and stress caught up with Pauli, and their doctor in New York City recommended that they apply to Camp Terra, a New Deal she camp in upstate New York where they could regain their health. Pauli's health did recover in the 3 months that they were at Camp Terra, and they also fell head over heels for the hiking counselor, Peggy Holmes. The two of them left Camp Terra together in the spring of 1935 and spent 5 weeks hitchhiking to Nebraska and back. When they returned to New York City, they got involved in the labor movement, which Pauli credits with radicalizing her views on freedom and dignity for Black Americans. The end of that relationship marked a crisis point in Pauli's life. The two split because Peggy couldn't or wouldn't understand Pauli as a man and disappeared from Pauli's life. In response, Pauli had a mental health crisis that landed them at Bellevue Hospital, grappling with who they were and where they belonged in the world. Stays at psychiatric hospitals would become a regular part of Pauli's life as they sought treatment for depression and what we would now probably call gender dysphoria. They kept detailed notes about their thoughts and feelings and the treatments they'd tried to access, none of which were discovered until after their death. Although they were relatively open about having relationships with women, nobody but Aunt Pauline and presumably Peggy knew the depths of their struggles with their gender. Pauli applied to a PhD program at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1938 and was rejected for being Black. They wrote letters to the university president, to state officials, and even to President Roosevelt, then sent all of the responses to newspapers to publish in the hopes that they'd be shamed into desegregating the public university. It didn't work, but the fiery letters she wrote to President Roosevelt caught Eleanor Roosevelt's attention, and the two of them struck up a correspondence that blossomed into a decades-long friendship. In 1940, 15 years before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, Pauli and a friend were arrested in Petersburg, Virginia, for refusing to move to the back of a bus. The NAACP wouldn't defend them in court because they were only charged with disorderly conduct and not with violating segregation laws. So the Workers' Defense League stepped in to provide defense and ultimately pay their fine. Pauli went to work for the WDL a few months later, work that inspired her to become a civil rights attorney. Pauli coined the term Jane Crow during her first year of law school at Howard University to describe the combined impact of racial segregation and sex discrimination. For the first 2 years, they were the only woman at Howard University, and on Pauli's first day, a professor looked them in the face and said they didn't understand why women bothered to go to law school. While at Howard, Pauli published articles challenging segregation in the U.S. military and acted as advisor to the student chapter of the NAACP. They also participated in sit-ins that successfully desegregated a Washington, D.C. restaurant 16 years before the Woolworth's lunch counter sit-in. Civil rights legal strategies were a huge topic of conversation at Howard, and Pauli fundamentally disagreed with the prevailing belief that they should be focusing their energies on securing equal resources for Black Americans. Pauli's belief that separate but equal was a delusion that did violence to the Black community was laughable to their peers. So, they wrote their senior paper on why and how Plessy v. Ferguson, the 1896 Supreme Court ruling that enshrined separate but equal, could be overturned. Their professor, Spotswood Robinson, accepted both Pauli's paper and their $10 bet that Plessy would be overturned. A decade later, as part of the team arguing Brown v. Board of Education in front of the Supreme Court, Spotswood Robinson and Thurgood Marshall used Pauli's paper to help craft their legal case. Their win in Brown v. Board of Education, which was based largely on Pauli's legal strategy, overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. So yeah, Pauli won that bet. As the top graduate in Howard Law's class of 1944, Pauli was entitled to a fellowship to study at Harvard University. But Harvard did not admit women, and even a letter of recommendation from President Roosevelt couldn't overturn that policy. They ended up doing postgraduate work at Berkeley, where their master's thesis would eventually become part of the foundation for Ruth Bader Ginsburg's strategy as the director of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. Ginsburg and Pauli met when they were an attorney and Ginsburg was a summer associate at a law firm in Manhattan. Pauli also met the love of their life at that law firm, the office manager, Irene Barlow. Pauli called them Renee and said that the chemistry of their connection produced sparks of sheer joy. They stayed together until Renee's death in 1973. Pauli was busy between 1950 and 1973. They published states' laws on race and color, which Thurgood Marshall called the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. They were appointed to Kennedy's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. They were the first Black person to earn a doctorate of law from Yale University. They taught the first African American Studies and Women's Studies class at Brandeis and then became one of the first Black professors to be tenured there. They were one of the first to speak out about the sexism in the Civil Rights Movement, writing an open letter to A. Philip Randolph calling out the fact that no women had been invited to give major speeches or to join the White House delegation for the March on Washington. They wrote Jane Crow and the Law, Sex Discrimination and Title VII for the George Washington Law Review, an article so important that it made it to President Lyndon B. Johnson's desk and is still studied in law schools. In 1966, they co-founded the National Organization for Women with Betty Friedan, and in 1971, RBG credited them as a co-author on her brief for Reed versus Reed. And these are just the highlights. Almost every single federal protection for women or minorities, and almost every single social movement of the 20th century has Pauli Murray's fingerprints all over it. After Renee's death in 1973, Pauli left their position at Brandeis and went to seminary. They earned their Masters of Divinity and were ordained as a deacon in 1976. And when the Episcopal Church started ordaining women as priests, Pauli was one of the first women and the first Black woman to be ordained in 1977. They spent the next 7 years writing, speaking, and ministering to the sick. Pauli Murray died of pancreatic cancer in 1985 at the age of 75. They finished their autobiography just a few months before they passed, and it was published in 1987. Pauli Murray was a multi-ethnic, genderqueer person whose unique position in the liminal space between multiple intersecting identities made them, according to their biographer, uniquely positioned to grasp one of the most important ideas of the 20th century, that the categories of race and gender are essentially arbitrary and not a legal basis for discrimination. They were a visionary not in spite of their identity, but because of it. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.